everyone. My name is John Williams. I'm the Chief Executive of the Institute of Leadership and Management, and I welcome you to Late on LinkedIn Live, late being leadership at the edge. Did you see what I did there? I'm glad you can join me to share ideas across the community of leadership practice everywhere. Each month, I'm joined by senior leaders from all around the world to discuss their real-life experiences, to challenge some outdated leadership practices, and to offer a fresh take on the issues that today's leaders face. Following a recent podcast with Leila Rao on cognitive leadership, we wanted to continue this actually very thought-provoking conversation and invite you to join the discussion, where you can submit questions and share your reflections and experiences directly in the comments, which you should see, a column for which you should see on your screen. With over 20 years of experience, Leila is an organizational change consultant, optimizing the ability of organizations to transform, and also the co-founder of Lean In Agile, applying her expertise and experiences to increase the value and visibility of women through collective empowerment. Leila is also the creator of the Compass for Agility framework and author of the book with the same title. So who better to share their expert insights and advice on how to transform yourself and your business? Leila, welcome.
So glad to be here, John.
It's really, really nice to be able to have the conversation, to chat again, and to be able to chat a little bit more about cognitive leadership. Because I remember when we first touched on this, I thought this sounds like one of those management things that I've missed, that's been around for some time, and I should have known more about it. But in actual fact, having Googled it, it looks like this is a relatively new kid on the block. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you see as cognitive leadership?
Sure. So cognitive basically comes down to how we think. And so much of leadership and knowledge work in the world today is all about how do we think, how do we perceive, how do we understand. Yet somehow those core competencies are not represented in our business, in our management and leadership. So when I say cognitive leadership, I mean, how do we bring in the thinking, the invisible part of our work, decision-making, risk-taking, interpretation, perception into our work world so that we can have the impact that most of us want to have.
That's very interesting, because as you say there, the key here is having the impact that most of us want to have. One of the things that we tend to focus on in leadership terms is having an impact that's measurable. Because I know that one of the things that most unsettles leadership figures is having to be responsible for stuff that can't be measured. How do we reconcile that in a cognitive leadership sense?
Most of the things that matter really cannot be measured, and that it's people, and I work mostly in IT organizations, and there is a sense of like, but why are we talking about these people soft skill stuff? And my usual retort has been, until we get to a time when we have AI bots working with other AI bots to empower AI bots, IT is a people business. And people cannot be put successfully or sustainably in boxes and measured. We don't have the language, let alone the metrics, to measure thinking, to measure understanding. There is no numbers for this, which is why it's hard. But for almost every organization, certainly the ones I work with, the value for their customers and stakeholders is not just what they do, but how they do what they do. And that how comes down to cognitive leadership. How do we bring people in? How do we explain what value is to our customers? How do we understand their value?
Really interesting there. First of all, that very I'll use the term thought-provoking again. That statement that most of the things that matter cannot be measured, because of course there are lots of management people out there who will immediately say, well, what about return on investment, for example? What about profitability? What about these numbers and stuff like that? They can all be measured, and of course they matter. Yet at the same time, in a way, they're the outcome of doing the people things that you mention. Do you think it's time, as you said, we don't have the language, let alone the metrics. Do you think it's time for us to actually devise the language and the metrics to allow leadership to feel comfortable with this apparently unmeasurable stuff?
Yes, and so we do need the language and metrics, but I
Mhm.
go back to a quote that I've heard Pat Reed say that still resonates with me. The common phrasing is, you have to see to believe, but she says you have to believe to see.
Okay.
If you believe that people matter, then yes, the language and the metrics will emerge. But if you don't believe that people matters, no amount of language and metrics will move that needle.
That's very interesting because if I looked at this from say, a business school perspective, I would say not only does there need to be a language and a set of metrics, but it needs to be a universally accepted language and set of metrics. And it feels like what you're saying to me is actually, if the language and the metrics are okay between the leader and the people they are engaging with, it doesn't really matter what the template might say, because the
Part of that universal, who's defined. And it cannot just be the usual experts that define what is universal. So I would say it is that shared agreement between those leading and those being led. Do we have a language to describe our intent and our perception? If we do, that's all good. If we don't, it doesn't matter what the experts say.
Very interesting, and I actually have been recently doing a leadership development program, and we were talking about the idea of shared understanding, and what you've just described there fits perfectly with it. This shared agreement, this shared understanding about what are we talking about, and what do we want to achieve with it. There's a very interesting comment in the comments feed actually, where one of our participants has said, "I've been told on more than one occasion you are not paid to think." What a tremendous illustration that is of almost wrong footing, I think, in leadership terms.
Yes, and you can hear my sigh come across the screen
Yeah.
because everybody should be paid to think. It is a privilege, but it's also the price of being a human being. If we want people to come in and be their best selves at work, we have to account for them to bring in their cognitive abilities, their thinking, their perception, their understanding. Almost every leader I work with says, our people are our resources. Well,
Mhm.
if you believe that, then you do have to acknowledge that you're paying for people to think and to add the products of their thinking and understanding to that
Mhm.
shared body of knowledge and understanding.
That's absolutely great. Absolutely great. One of the other points that's been made in the comments is about um, many companies are too outcome focused. This is Chris Mackey, and thank you, Richard Gadd, by the way, for the first point there, because many companies can be too outcome focused. Interestingly, the often in conversation, the opposite of outcome is process. So we don't want companies to be too process focused, and we don't really want them to be only outcome focused. It feels like with a cognitive leadership approach, there's something between the two, which is almost an amalgam of outcome and process and getting the best from each. Does that sound too simplistic?
Not at all, because I think the best processes and the processes that are most relevant in complex, uncertain environments is co-created. So, in the
Okay.
cognitive sense, once we're clear on the outcomes, because we have that shared language and understanding, then the process will emerge because we're both clear on the outcome. We can talk about what can we do now? What is next? We don't have to plan out the next 5 years because there is that trust that we will co-create the journey as we're learning and discovering, knowing that we have a clear and shared outcome.
Very, very interesting. I have to say, I apologize to everybody here. Almost everything that you say, I'm having to say very interesting, because it is. It's fascinating because it's taking us on in directions actually quite far beyond what I actually had thought about cognitive leadership. An interesting comment here from Caroline Housley, who says she works with a team who mainly use British Sign Language, so that language might not fit a standard measure. Therefore, the idea and acceptance of variances is demonstrably valid.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that because when most people think about lean, they think of standardization. That is
Mhm.
Lean Six Sigma. The kind
Yeah.
of lean I work with is systems thinking lean, where variances are the value add. If we're doing the same thing the way everybody else does, then what is our unique value add as a company, as a service provider? Those variances are the opportunity that we have to be unique and to deliver that blue ocean strategy. Because if you want to go to blue ocean strategy, you have to find your variances.
Well, that leads me to say we're going to have another LinkedIn live session in future about blue ocean strategy, because I think that's something that we could explore for a long time. I came across, actually, when I Googled cognitive leadership, came across an interesting statement from Samson Hall, actually. I'm not sure of the date of this, but they said a vital component of the cognitive leader is the ability to forgive a mistake as long as it is learned from. So if one of my team makes a mistake and they learn from it, if I'm thinking as a leader, if I'm a thinking leader, then actually, as long as they learn a lesson from that, I should be able to forgive that mistake, almost regardless of the impact on the organization. That might not be quite what they meant, but I like that idea of being able to forgive a mistake as long as it's learned from. What do you think about that idea?
Yes, and celebrate the mistakes.
Okay.
It's so when we want people to think and to learn, we are going to make mistakes. All of us are.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of the society we have set up is sometimes the people at the top get to be rewarded for their mistakes, and yet we don't allow for those who are in the beginning stage of the journey to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
If all the statistics back this up. I'm not a big stats person, but innovation, Thomas Edison, you try 99 times, you fail 100. Like this is how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow we're trying to keep mistakes out of our ecosystem.
Yeah, I bore the team that I work with constantly by this idea that failure is the norm, because 99 times out of 100, the things that we do will fail. So if failure is the norm, then a success is a failure that went wrong. So we should actually be celebrating all of those mistakes as well and learning from them, but interrogating the successes the way we interrogate failures. Does that make sense?
Yes, because we tend to think that successes happen randomly and failures are the systematic approach. Like, I love the way you phrased it, because I know I failed so many times. And I have a mental list of all my failures. But I think becoming more a responsible person to me means recognizing that the success I've had is based on those failures I've had.
Mm-hmm.
I can't want one without recognizing the other.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because that idea of a mental list of all my failures, and I have exactly the same, I use that as my benchmark for assessing situations in which I am now and in the future. So I know this happened, I did that, it didn't work out. So actually, therefore, I need to do something different. Is there also, and this is, I think, possibly quite important in terms of cognitive leadership. We celebrate the mistakes because we want people to think and therefore to make mistakes. At the same time, we want people therefore to not be afraid to make mistakes. And there's this lovely question, what would I do if I was not afraid, that we should all ask, I think, in every sense. Is that something which is useful in the context of cognitive leadership?
Yes, because fear is a human reaction.
Mm.
I still get nervous and fearful when I do things like this. But part of failure and success is using that fear to give you momentum to move forward. And we tend to think of fear as a negative. Fear is simply fuel. What do you do with it? You can use it to freeze, or you can use it to jump off the cliff. Both are equally valid. So fear itself, it is what it is. What do you choose to do with it? That's the part that matters the most.
I love that. Fear is fuel. That's tremendous. That I shall use that when I'm coaching marathon runners. I'll just explain that to them. Just looking at some of the other things that actually are being said. Anna Costa reflective learning. And reflective learning, I came across the word reflective the other day. This is Richard Gadd again. I came across the word reflective the other day. We were talking about it, and somebody said that, yes, the problem is people spend too much time being reflective. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting concept, that actually we should spend, and it's the opposite of what you said. We should be paying people to think. Actually, we don't want anybody to think. We don't want wasting their time doing that sort of stuff. However, reflection is not just thinking. There's a sort of organized feel to reflective thinking, reflective learning. Is that part of the lexicon of cognitive leadership, do you think?
Absolutely. So, my background, as you know, is lean agile. So
Mm-hmm.
retrospectives are my favorite part about having an agile mindset.
Mm.
It is about making the time to look at not just how we're doing something, but why are we doing something? What assumptions have we made about this work, about the people involved, about the people we're trying to create impact for, our stakeholders, our customers? Because we all make assumptions. That's a good thing. But let's also make the time to look at our assumptions in the light of what we have learned so that we can continually refine. I mean, we talk about iterative and adaptive. That applies to us as well.
Mm-hmm.
What assumptions are we starting off with? Where am I at today? Where was I at when I made this decision? What changed in me? What changed in our organization, in our environment? Because organizations today, almost every one of them, they are in very complex ecosystems. Very few organizations are on an island.
Yep.
So do we have a language and a time and a space for looking at what's happening around us?
Mm-hmm.
Because when we don't, all of that becomes part of our subconscious that influences our decisions, but we don't ever examine the decisions that we've made. So
Yeah.
hitting that pause to say, how did you do this? What were you thinking when you did this?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't see it that way. Oh, interesting. Okay, let's see what we can do now that we're talking about the thinking part. Talking about thinking is hard, but it's also fun and incredibly valuable once you get used to it.
That's another good phrase. Talking about thinking is hard. Actually, yes, it is. And interestingly, on that note, Miriam Spidell in the comments has said business storytelling should be used more to put a spotlight on cognitive leadership, because that's a way of talking about thinking.
Yes, absolutely. And connect back to the comments. Everybody is a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
Storytelling cannot be the privilege of the leaders because
Ah,
we all have a story to tell. And all of those stories should be heard. And the business story should be something that includes elements from everyone's stories. And whether we call it, diversity, equity, inclusion explicitly or not, it's a whole elephant in the room thing. We all see different parts of it. So to me, a compelling business story is inclusive. It puts in what everybody else sees because we all see something nobody else sees. And if we can pull that together, we are going to have a compelling business story that can not just spark change, but sustain change and deliver the outcomes.
that's very powerful. The idea that the business story is this amalgam of all of the stories of the people within the business, because that, in a sense, in old leadership language, in management language, that would mean everybody is bought into the business. So actually, everybody is speaking the business story, the whole story. Very powerful indeed. Incidentally, we just an issue here from Mosin Miluluwawa Ayodele, and it says there's a major issue of leadership lies where the major issue of leadership lies. Leaders who see delegation as a loss of control, when really it's empowerment. Talk to me about trust, Leila.
Okay, so trust has become my favorite word these days because it is a business appropriate language to talk about the things that we can't yet talk about, which is fear
Mm-hmm.
and control and loss of control and all of those things. Trust comes down to is who do we trust and how do we trust? No leader leads by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
At minimum, every organization I've ever come across has a leadership team.
Yep.
what is the degree of trust among that leadership team? A lot of times what I see is they are kind of doing their own thing and connecting at logistics, but the deeper work is done individually.
Right.
When that happens for the people they're leading and stakeholders, it's a disjointed experience. Okay, how did this connect to that? They're not seeing the connection because the leadership team has not done the co-creation work, and that requires trust. Co-creation, you can't do without trust. It's, am I seeing what you're seeing? And do I trust you to understand what I see, even if you don't see it?
Interesting. So co-creation requires trust. The implication of that is that, in a sense, comes back to this idea of what would I do if I was not afraid? Because when we trust someone, we make ourselves vulnerable. We give away some of our protections and stuff like this. Is one of the roles of cognitive leadership to encourage and indeed empower, but to encourage the whole team to give away some of that, to be vulnerable to a degree?
Absolutely. And I'm rephrasing my language around this because the minute I say vulnerable, people shut down and don't want to be vulnerable. Okay. So right. Yep. The way I've been phrasing it is trading the perception of certainty for the certainty of transparency. So it's a little long-winded saying you're actually going to have more control when you let go because you're going to see things in real time. You're not going to be blindsided. And for most leaders in complex organizations, they're responsible and accountable to their stakeholders and their bosses. So yep. When I can say explicitly, the promise is that you will never be blindsided, that resonates at a very fundamental level, whether or not they'll acknowledge the fear of being blindsided.
Right.
So transparency and co-creation is actually safer for everybody.
Wow, that's a paradigm shift, really. This, as you said, the perception of transparency, which many leaders will have because they think they know what's going on in the organization, the perception of certainty, because for the certainty of transparency, that's a huge mind shift for many leaders, and especially those who, like me, have come up for many years through a not quite Taylorism, but certainly a more assertive form of leadership and stuff like that. How do we do that? How do we encourage more leaders to make that move to transparency? And I guess this is what cognitive leadership attempts to do, really.
It is. And I phrased it as aligning your actions to your intent so that your outcome can be realized. Most leaders today will say, yes, I want to empower my people. I want my people to be innovative. Okay. What if your behaviors actually is a trigger for that intent?
Right.
So cognitive leadership for me is about incorporating the invisible work and making it explicit through our behaviors.
Right.
So if you're a cognitive leader, think about the ways in which you show up as a leader. What are the very specific behavior shifts that you can do? For example, one of the best leaders I work with, what I've seen, when someone says something, he's just like, where the hell are you going with this? I can see him mentally stop and say, that's interesting. Tell me more. Mm-hmm. And that is a pattern shift that he has created for himself. And that's an example of cognitive leadership.
Right.
How do we give ourselves that moment pause so that we don't default to our instinctive reactions?
That clearly illustrates that cognitive leadership is obviously not just a nice to have principle that we bandy about in leadership and things. It is, first of all, a behavior, which is great because I think of leadership, all forms of leadership, as being behaviors, but it's a behavior, therefore, that can be learned, if we call it that.
And measured. Because the thing about behaviors are, they're visible, they're measurable. And if you want quantifiable metrics, tracking behavior will get you there pretty quickly.
Oh, very interesting. We will one day have to have another conversation about how we measure behaviors, and it might be that we measure them in the impact that they have on other people's behaviors and stuff like that. But I think that would be very interesting. But a comment, Anna Costa, who talks about the ability to put yourself out there. I really like that, because that, we think about the words that I might have used, which would be trust and vulnerability. The better phrase that you used was, trading the perception of certainty for the certainty of transparency. Putting yourself out there is an active behavior, not a passive one. So somebody once said to me, trust is based on reciprocity. You need to show trust before you get trust. Do you think is it absolutely right to say cognitive leadership behaviors are likely to produce cognitive responses from people, and potentially cognitive leadership responses, of course, because we want to develop leaders? Do you think that's the pattern?
Absolutely. Cognitive leadership is the most sustainable approach I can think of, because as human beings, we do behavior response. Like, this is how we're wired. Mm-hmm. And that's what cognitive leadership comes down to, is taking advantage of what we're wired to do as human beings. Because when you say something, I respond to that. When you do something, I respond. And if leadership can be intentional about what behaviors they're exhibiting, they're going to see a change in other person's behavior. Then you reinforce it or you shift until you get the response that you want. So much is within our ability to say, what am I trying to get from here? How can I try different things to get there? What thing am I trying that's hitting the right note? Not a musician, but if you're an orchestra, mm-hmm. playing together is a very different skill than just mastering an instrument, because it requires listening. It requires improvisation. So improvisation, and that's co-creation, right? Co-creation really is improvisational. It's taking something that somebody else has and not dismissing it, but integrating it into your activity and your behavior and your strategy.
Brilliant. Leila, we are just a minute and a half away or thereabouts from the end, and that's a tremendous conversation, and I think half a dozen new conversations to come out of this one. I think really there are a whole bunch of other comments and questions, and we will follow up actually, and later, if I can come back to you later and say, let's address some of these, and we'll maybe go back to people and let them get the answers to some of their questions. But in the meantime, I guess thank you certainly to you, Leila. A special thanks to you as our guest for a fantastic conversation, really a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much indeed to everybody in the comment stream, everybody who's online now listening and watching us. And please do join the conversation, follow on conversation via social media. You can use the hashtag #LeadershipAtTheEdge. And for more of our events and lots of other content, visit the website at www.institutelm.com. And thank you very, very much, Leila in particular, you, our audience, and everyone for listening and giving us so much to make this a valuable session. Thank you, Leila.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And for